The lawyer's office smelled like old leather bindings and aggressive lemon polish. My mother was wearing the exact composed, terrifying smile she usually reserved for charity, galas, and society dinners. My parents had summoned me down to the city as though we were gathering for a holiday celebration. My older brother sat perfectly upright between them in a tailored charcoal suit that still held the faint crease of a fresh dry cleaning. I honestly believed we were there to settle my grandmother's estate. We were not. I took my seat in a rigid, high-backed chair, folding my hands carefully in my lap, and I watched my mother smooth the invisible wrinkles from her skirt. Deep down, some primal instinct in my chest went entirely still and watchful. The way your body reacts when the air pressure drops right before a severe storm hits. What none of them comprehended. Sitting there in that heavily draped, silent room was that 3 years from that exact moment, I would be the solitary reason any part of our family legacy still existed. If you have ever belonged to a family that calculated your worth by what you could display on a shelf rather than the burdens you quietly carried in the dark, this is your story. My name is Clara Vance. I was 32 years old that coastal autumn, and I still harbored the foolish belief that love in my family was a currency you could eventually earn simply by showing up and doing the hard work. Grandmother Eleanor had been resting in the cemetery for exactly 3 weeks. I drove 4 hours down the coast from Portland, fully expecting a standard reading of her will, expecting tedious discussions about the working boatyard, expecting to sit in the periphery and remain unseen, just as I always had. Instead, the lawyer pushed a thick manila folder across the polished mahogany table. The tab did not bear my grandmother's name. It bore my parents' names. It was a living trust, entirely controlled by them. A document they could have easily mailed to me with a standard postage stamp. So why go through the theatrical effort of gathering the entire family into one suffocating room, dressing my brother like a banking executive, ordering a fresh carafe of expensive coffee, and making me sit there to hear it read aloud? My mother interlaced her fingers like a woman waiting patiently for a sermon to begin. My father kept his gaze fixed firmly on the brass handles of the window shutters, staring at them as if they held the secrets of the universe. The first icy thread of realization pulled painfully tight across my ribs before the lawyer even cleared his throat. He read the document with the flat, mechanical cadence of a man reading a train schedule. The Blackwood Marina, the historic boatyard, the deep water slips my great-grandfather had dredged by hand, the commercial accounts, the waterfront acreage, all of it, valued at roughly $5 million, was held in an irrevocable trust for my brother, Julian. Then the lawyer reached the second paragraph, and he did not even pause to take a breath. To my daughter, Clara. Having given extensive and careful consideration to the matter, I leave absolutely nothing. The words echoed in my ears twice before my brain actually processed their meaning. Julian's face flushed a deep, uncomfortable crimson. He reached out to touch my arm under the table, and I allowed it only because his hand was trembling violently in mine. Strangely, was completely still. My mother watched my face the entire time, her eyes bright and hungry, waiting for the tears, waiting for the collapse. When the collapse did not happen, she leaned back against the leather upholstery, utterly satisfied, and delivered the sentence she had undoubtedly been practicing in the mirror for years. You always lacked the vision required to sustain this family. The air conditioning hummed a low, mocking note in the corner of the room. Not a single person sitting at that enormous table raised their voice to defend me. I asked, my voice completely steady, if I could look at the paperwork. The lawyer hesitated, looking immediately to my mother for permission, before reluctantly turning the heavy pages so I could read the final clause at the bottom. It was a strict no-contest provision. If I attempted to challenge any single sentence of the trust, I would automatically forfeit any microscopic remnant of inheritance I might ever be offered in the future. Down to the final penny. Then my eyes fell upon the date printed neatly next to the notary stamp. And that was the detail that completely shattered the floor beneath my feet. 18 months earlier, this was not a sudden decision born from the chaotic grief of losing a matriarch. This was not a panicked choice made in a hospital corridor during a difficult week. My parents had sat in this exact room a year and a half ago, debated every single syllable, and constructed a massive steel door with the locking mechanism entirely on their side. Then they had waited patiently until my grandmother was buried in the ground. Waited until I had taken time off work to drive down for the funeral, just to slam that door directly in my face with an audience present to witness it. My mother's serene smile had not wavered for a fraction of a second. She had orchestrated the timing flawlessly. Julian finally managed to find his voice. "Mom, surely we can figure something out." And then he stopped. The words simply died in the heavy air because my mother slowly turned her head and looked at him. My older brother, a grown man in a tailored suit, was still a person who could be completely silenced by a single look from that woman. My father continued his intense study of the window shutters. He was 68 years old and had spent 4 solid decades allowing my mother to dictate every belief, every grudge, and every narrative our family held, simply so he would never have to bear the uncomfortable burden of making a choice himself. I inhaled one slow breath and understood the entire room. Not one single person at that mahogany table was going to speak my name with any warmth. Not the lawyer whose bills they paid. Not Julian, who genuinely cared for me, but was far more terrified of our mother's wrath than he was devoted to my well-being. Not my father, who could have dismantled the entire cruel charade with one firm sentence, but instead chose to count the wooden slats on the blinds. There was absolutely nothing left for me to salvage in that room. So, I stood up. I did not raise my voice. I did not make frantic threats. I had learned during my childhood that pleading in our family was the equivalent of handing your executioner a sharper blade. I looked down at the thick folder and at the expensive fountain pen the lawyer had placed on the table just in case there was some minor receipt for me to acknowledge. There was nothing. "I see," I said quietly. "Then there is no reason for me to leave my signature here." My mother lifted her chin, her expression radiating the triumphant validation of a woman who had just proven a theory she had held for decades. When I was 14, she began introducing me to extended relatives as the difficult child, saying it with the exhausted, long-suffering tone one might use to describe a stray dog that refused to learn commands. I picked up my car keys from the polished wood. Julian said my name once, his voice cracking slightly, sounding like a question he was too afraid to finish. I did not look back. I knew that if I turned my head, I would be forced to watch him remain frozen in his chair, choosing them over me. I walked out of the room, breathing in the scent of stale lemon polish, and pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me. It closed with a solid, definitive click. Like the final punctuation mark at the end of a novel, somebody else had ghostwritten for my life. I walked out to the sunlit parking garage, got into my truck, and I did not start the engine. My hands finally began to shake. They shook violently, uncontrollably. Now that there was no one left in the world to witness my cracking facade, this is the specific detail people always misunderstand when they hear the rumors about my departure. They assume I walked away cold, unfeeling, and detached. I was not cold. I was a 32-year-old woman who had just been informed, in a room financed by her own parents, that a lifetime of loyalty and unseen labor amounted to absolutely nothing of value. And yet, sitting there gripping the leather steering wheel in a concrete garage. One blinding thought eclipsed the grief. It embarrasses me slightly to admit the raw truth of it even now. One day, I promised the empty truck cab, I am going to build a legacy so massive and so undeniably brilliant that they will be forced to look at it and admit they were completely wrong about me. That was the toxic venom already circulating in my bloodstream. I did not care about the millions of dollars. I cared about the desperate, hollow wanting, the pathetic wanting to be recognized and valued by the exact same people who had just legally documented their refusal to ever do so. I drove the 4 hours back up the coast to Portland and unlocked the door to my small, practical apartment. It was modest. It was quiet. And most importantly, no one inside those walls had ever held up a measuring tape to calculate my flaws. I worked as a historic preservation architect and maritime grant specialist. I was the person quietly navigating the complex, obscure world of coastal zoning laws, federal heritage grants, and structural rehabilitation for failing historic properties. When an old maritime family was on the verge of losing their multi-generational dock to commercial real estate developers, I was the one who scoured the archives and found the obscure legal loophole nobody else knew existed. I was incredibly good at my job. I was also entirely invisible while doing it. I was the person crunching the numbers in the dusty back office, while the politicians and the property owners stood on the freshly painted docks, shaking hands and absorbing the applause. That was the mold I had been poured into, the shape I had been filed down into by 32 years of family conditioning. I deliberately took on more contracts than I could reasonably handle. I worked until 2 in the morning, accepted every frantic phone call from desperate harbor masters, and filled every waking hour with complex architectural blueprints. When my mind was occupied with calculating load-bearing capacities for wooden piers, I did not have to sit in the silence and feel the gaping void in my chest. That specific night, I opened 4 new project files simply to avoid feeling the crushing weight of the afternoon. A fishing cooperative 3 towns over was trying to save their waterfront from a luxury hotel developer, and I drafted their protective easement with cold, mechanical precision, filing it away before dawn. I had no idea that I was staring directly at the blueprint that would eventually rewrite my own life. Here is the vital context my mother conveniently omitted during her performance in the lawyer's office. During the final 2 years of my grandmother Eleanor's life, when the arthritis twisted her hands into knots and the dementia scrambled her memories like a broken television signal, I was the one who drove down the coast every single Friday night. I balanced the Blackwood Marina accounting ledgers after the yard manager quit in frustration. I tracked down the expired maritime insurance policies and paid the overdue lumber invoices that my parents had simply ignored. I sat awake with Eleanor through the darkest hours of the night. Her mind would slip back to 1974, believing my grandfather was still down at the docks repairing sails. I learned to swallow my own grief and gently tell her, "Yes, he is finishing up the rigging. You should rest now." I learned that correcting her only forced her to experience the agonizing trauma of his death all over again. Julien, meanwhile, was living in a high-rise apartment in Boston, building his wealth management portfolio, and absolutely no one in the family held his absence against him. Truthfully, I did not resent him for it either. But when the final audit of our family was calculated, when the exact monetary value of each child was printed onto legal stationery, the daughter who had carried the matriarch through the terrifying darkness of losing her mind was branded the disappointment. The son who had arranged for expensive floral deliveries on major holidays was handed the entire legacy, and not one single person in that mahogany room thought the math was flawed. That was the invisible gravity of the house I grew up in. My grandmother Eleanor used to tell me something when we walked the wooden docks together at dawn. I was perhaps 10 years old. She would rest her calloused hand on the damp wooden pilings and look out at the fog. The tide remembers who respects the water, she would say. Not who holds the paper deed. Who respects the water? I did not comprehend her meaning back then. I assumed it was just poetic wisdom from an old boat builder. Shortly after her funeral, the old harbor master had approached me quietly and pressed a heavy, vintage cedar box into my hands. He whispered that Eleanor had specifically asked him to keep it safe for me. Long before her mind started slipping away, it felt dense, packed tightly with folded papers. I had carried it up the stairs to my Portland apartment, shoved it into the deepest, darkest corner of my bedroom closet, and refused to open the latch. I could not do it. Some forms of grief require you to build up a thick layer of emotional scar tissue before you can look directly at them. I promised myself I would open the cedar box when I stopped feeling like I was suffocating. The contents of that box would have drastically altered the trajectory of the next 3 years had I possessed the courage to look inside. I did not. The box sat in the darkness, waiting for me, with the same endless patience my grandmother had always shown me. So, I made a concrete resolution. For the first time in my existence, the choice belonged entirely to me. I stopped driving down the coast. I stopped answering the condescending phone calls that always ended with me, apologizing for my mother's imagined slights. I closed the heavy iron gate on Blackwood Marina and I threw away the key. 3 entire years evaporated into the wind. One quiet, unremarkable season blending into the next. I expanded my preservation firm methodically, saving one historic coastal property at a time. My reputation spread like a quiet current through a small, fiercely loyal community of working-class maritime families. They remembered the woman who helped them keep their livelihoods afloat. I stopped waiting for my parents to acknowledge my existence. Or, more accurately, I constructed a very convincing lie and told myself I had stopped waiting, which is an entirely different psychological state. Though I would not learn that lesson until much later. For 3 years, my personal phone never rang with a call from home. And then, on a painfully mundane Thursday afternoon in late November, the silence broke. By this point in my life, I was the undisputed authority people sought out when a historic waterfront was bleeding out. I was 35 years old, operating out of a beautiful brick office near the harbor, with 3 junior architects on my payroll. I had built an entire kingdom out of the invisible, unglamorous labor my family despised. I had inadvertently transformed into the exact powerful, capable woman that my 10-year-old self had desperately needed to see. The poetic irony of it was a bitter pill I swallowed on lonely nights. I was a savior for strangers, ensuring they kept the docks their ancestors built. Yet I returned every evening to a silent apartment devoid of any family ties. What I still could not manage to do, even after 3 years of professional triumph, was drive past the highway exit for Blackwood without my chest seizing in a knot of panic. I always took a grueling 30-minute detour through the back roads just to avoid seeing the rusted welcome sign of my hometown. You do not touch a severe burn even long after the skin has turned to scars. I genuinely believed I had conquered my past by putting 100 miles of coastline between us. But peace manufactured entirely out of avoidance is merely a temporary ceasefire disguised as a victory. I was about to be educated in this reality through the most brutal method possible. The phone call began as standard industry routine. A regional coastal commission needed my specialized consultation regarding a list of distressed commercial maritime properties scheduled for a brutal bank auction in the coming spring. These were multi-generational boatyards that had run out of time, money, and miracles. The commission director began reading down her printed list, rattling off parcel numbers and family names, while I took precise notes on my legal pad, mentally categorizing which structures could be salvaged. Then she read a name that I had spent 36 months forbidding myself from speaking aloud. Then we have the Blackwood parcel down south," she said, her tone entirely conversational. "That one is spiraling fast. Word on the water is the family vastly overextended, and they are drowning in commercial debt." My expensive pen stopped moving across the paper. The ink pooled into a dark blue stain. I forced my throat to open, keeping my voice utterly devoid of emotion, and asked her to repeat the last property. She obliged. The Blackwood Marina, the $5 million crown jewel my mother had smugly handed to my brother across a mahogany table, the magnificent legacy that I was too uninspired and disappointing to inherit, was currently sitting on a sterile list of properties about to be liquidated and sold for scrap metal. For a terrifying, endless moment, I could not feel the phone pressed against my ear. I thanked the director with mechanical politeness, promised to review the files, and disconnected the line before my breathing could betray my panic. I immediately resorted to the only coping mechanism I possessed. I plunged into the paperwork. I pulled the county property records and the commercial lien registries that very afternoon, executing the search with the exact same ruthless efficiency I would use for any desperate client. Because numbers printed on a screen do not lie, and they do not require you to process your trauma to understand them. What the public records revealed was infinitely worse than the casual rumors. The irrevocable trust contained massive amounts of prime real estate, but virtually zero liquid capital. Julien, in his infinite financial wisdom, had taken out an astronomical commercial mortgage against the boatyard to cover the exorbitant estate taxes and fund a catastrophic attempt to convert the working docks into a luxury yacht club. When the zoning board fought his luxury permits, the construction stalled. He had then stacked a predatory second mortgage on top of the first to cover the bleeding. The luxury conversion had failed spectacularly. Now, a ruthless commercial bank had started the foreclosure countdown. A clock that only ticks toward destruction. $5 million in land value. Absolutely paralyzed by debt. It was the most classic, devastating trap in coastal real estate. The exact catastrophe I spent my entire career reversing for other people. My parents had bypassed the daughter who understood zoning laws and handed a maritime empire to a son who had never so much as tied a cleat hitch in his life. And they had celebrated this decision as a triumph. It was not a gift. It was a live grenade wrapped in expensive legal paper, and a dark, vicious, unforgiving part of my soul looked at those catastrophic numbers on the screen and thought, with absolute clarity, let them sink. If you have ever stood in the shadows and watched your family hand the keys to the kingdom to the most incompetent person in the room simply because they played the part better, you know the exact temperature of the rage burning in my chest. I recalled the specific afternoon they announced his inheritance. Long before the formal lawyer meeting, it was at a summer regatta luncheon at the local yacht club. Underneath striped awnings and the clinking of champagne glasses, my mother was absolutely radiant, holding court with the local elite, proudly announcing to anyone who would listen that Julien was going to modernize Blackwood and bring it into the 21st century. The wealthy neighbors nodded approvingly, offering their congratulations. My father stood half a step behind her, projecting his usual silent, complicit pride. It was a flawless theatrical production. Julien had stood there soaking in the adoration, entirely convinced of his own genius. Because it is intoxicating to be the golden protagonist of your mother's favorite story. Now, that exact same golden praise had hardened into a concrete block chained to his ankle. Julien could not list the property for sale without confessing to the entire eastern seaboard that he had completely destroyed the legacy our mother had publicly sworn he would elevate. He could not beg the family for a bailout without admitting that the perfect son had driven the empire into a brick wall in less than 3 years. My mother had dressed him in a costume of competence that he could never possibly fill, called it maternal love, and completely ignored the psychological crushing weight she was placing on his shoulders. Later that week, I bumped into an old acquaintance named Sarah, a marine surveyor who grew up one harbor over from us. We were both attending a dull municipal zoning hearing in Portland. Small coastal towns function on a currency of whispered secrets, and Sarah was practically wealthy with them. She filled in the devastating blanks without me even having to prompt her. Julian was in a complete panic, drinking too much and hiding from his creditors. My father had suffered a minor stroke during the previous winter. It was not fatal, but it had aged him a decade in a month, leaving him fragile and largely confined to an armchair. My mother, entirely true to her nature, was desperately holding the crumbling facade together with sheer willpower, expensive scarves, and an absolute, terrifying refusal to let the local society see a single drop of blood in the water. It is a tragedy what is happening down there, Sarah murmured, her eyes searching my face for a reaction. Whatever the history is between you all, I offered no correction. I stood in the corridor holding a lukewarm coffee, and I felt a sensation I violently wished to suppress. It was the deep, agonizing, magnetic pull of a family that had looked me in the eye and told me I was defective. My father was sick and wasting away. The boatyard was dying. I hated myself for how deeply the news rattled my ribcage. That evening, I paced the hardwood floors of my apartment, torn between two completely different versions of myself. The wounded, hardened woman screamed, "Let it burn to the ground." They engineered this disaster. They sat across a mahogany table, looked at your devotion, called it worthless, and chose this exact path. The destruction of the boatyard is not an act of cruelty on my part. It is simply the inescapable mathematics of their own arrogance coming due. But the other version of me was much quieter, and I mistrusted her deeply because her motives were complicated. She wanted to swoop down the coast like an avenging angel, deploy my brilliant legal strategies, save the historic docks, and stand victorious in that same lawyer's office, while my parents finally drowned in the realization of their massive mistake. And buried beneath both of those women, hidden so deep I could barely hear it, a tiny, authentic voice whispered a devastating question. If you only save the boatyard to force them to feel regret, whose validation are you still desperately begging for? I turned off the bedside lamp without making a choice. But before I fell into a restless sleep, I finally dragged the heavy cedar box out from the suffocating darkness of my closet. I placed it squarely on my kitchen island, where the morning light would force me to confront it. The box smelled exactly like my grandmother. It smelled of dried salt, old parchment, and the faint, sharp tang of marine varnish. For an eternity, I simply stood in my quiet kitchen, resting my palms on the cool wood, allowing the grief to wash over me in massive lies, silent waves. Then, my hands remarkably steady, I opened the latch. I sifted through the contents with the methodical care of an archivist. There were original, hand-drafted blueprint water slips dating back 80 years. There were faded black and white photographs of my grandfather standing on a half-built hull. There were ancient municipal tax receipts kept for absolutely no logical reason, other than the fact that she cherished every piece of paper that proved the boatyard existed. And resting at the very bottom, tucked inside a heavy ivory envelope with my name penned in her declining, shaky cursive, was a letter. She must have written it during one of her lucid windows, perhaps a year before her mind completely fractured. Back when she still understood the dangerous currents flowing beneath our family dynamic, I pulled out a stool, sat alone in an apartment 100 miles away from the docks she built, and read the words my grandmother needed me to carry. She knew. That was the explosive truth waiting in the very first paragraph. No apologies. No softening of the blow. She knew my parents were heavily pressuring her lawyers to leave the entire estate to Julian. She knew exactly why my mother favored him. And she knew it was a catastrophic mistake. But her body was failing. Her mind was slipping. And she no longer possessed the ferocious energy required to fight my mother in a prolonged legal battle. So she did the only strategic thing left to her. She deliberately ensured I inherited no money. She knew that leaving me a financial percentage would only turn me into a target, trapping me in a vicious, endless lawsuit with my mother over the liquid assets. Instead, she left me the architecture of a rescue. In her careful, wavering script, she outlined a conversation she had held years ago with the director of the Federal Maritime Heritage Foundation. She noted that the entire Blackwood property, due to its age and contribution to the local fishing industry, perfectly qualified for a highly restrictive historic working waterfront easement. It was an obscure legal mechanism that would entirely erase the commercial debt, wipe out the crushing property taxes, and inject massive federal preservation funds into the estate. The absolute catch was that it legally locked the property as a commercial working boatyard in perpetuity. It made the land completely worthless to luxury developers, hotel chains, or yacht clubs. It was a weaponized legal strategy that only a person with my exact niche professional expertise would even know how to execute. At the bottom of the page, her handwriting fading into a barely legible scrawl, she wrote the sentence that would haunt me forever. "You will know exactly how to deploy this, my brilliant girl, because you are the only one in this house who ever truly loved the salt, not the status." I stared at that final line until my vision blurred. Loved the salt, not the status. She had diagnosed our entire family lineage in a dozen words. My parents and my brother had spent their lives obsessing over the optics, the prestige, the $5 million valuation printed at the top of a spreadsheet. Not one of them had ever willingly sanded a fiberglass hull or bled over a broken winch. Only Eleanor and I had done that, and she had left me the exact blueprint to save our history. Not to hand me ownership, not to force me back into the family hierarchy, but because I was the sole living person capable of translating her strategy into reality. The burden of choice rested entirely on my shoulders now. Completely removed from whatever my mother had dictated in that law office, I could leverage my network tomorrow morning and trigger the easement, or I could close the heavy cedar lid, slide the box back into the dust of my closet, and watch the bulldozers demolish my grandfather's docks in the spring. Regardless of the choice, I realized with a heavy heart I was going to have to drive back to Blackwood. So I made the drive. I navigated the long, winding coastal highway I had aggressively avoided for 3 years. My hands anticipated the sharp curve near the old lighthouse before my eyes even registered the road markers. I did not drive down the main access road to the docks. I pulled my truck onto a high, overlooking bluff where I could view the entire marina complex through the damp, salty air. I cut the engine and forced myself to look. The devastation was profound. The massive wooden travel lift was rusting and immobilized. The main repair shed had a massive hole in the corrugated roof, covered poorly by a violently flapping plastic tarp. The docks were largely empty of paying vessels. My grandmother would have unleashed a string of horrific curses at the sight of it. Down near the main office building, in the fading, bruised light of the afternoon, a tiny boy I had never met was pushing a bright yellow toy boat through a puddle in the gravel parking lot, laughing at the splash. He was perhaps 4 years old, my brother's son, my nephew, Leo, a child who had absolutely no concept of family politics, playing happily in the epicenter of a financial blast zone he was too small to comprehend. Then my eyes focused on the heavy glass door of the main office, taped aggressively to the center of the glass. Rippling slightly in the ocean breeze was a bright yellow legal document. I recognized the specific dimensions and color of that paper from years of standing on docks watching clients weep. I did not need binoculars to read the text. It was a notice of commercial foreclosure, the final, brutal administrative mechanism before the bank seizes the padlocks and calls the auctioneer. There was a notice of foreclosure taped to the door of the empire I was deemed too incompetent to manage. A 4-year-old boy playing in the mud beneath it, and my grandmother's blueprint burning a hole in my coat pocket. I sat on that cold bluff for hours, watching the gray water turn black, until Julian emerged from the office, looking exhausted and defeated, to carry little Leo into a car. When I finally started my engine and pointed my truck north toward Portland, the image of that yellow paper was permanently branded into my retinas. I did not make my final decision while looking at the water. I made it somewhere near the county border in the pitch black of night. The specific geometry of my decision shocked even my own cynical heart. I was going to save the boatyard, but I was not going to do it the way my bitter, 32-year-old self had fantasized about in that parking garage. I was not going to kick the doors in, deploy my brilliant legal maneuvers, and force my mother to choke on her own pride while she begged for my mercy. If I was going to execute this massive rescue, I was going to do it in the exact manner I had lived my entire life. The exact methodology that had caused them to label me a disappointment. I was going to do it quietly, invisibly, meticulously, and entirely in the shadows. They had spent 3 decades aggressively teaching me that invisible labor has no value, that a daughter who sacrifices without demanding a parade is fundamentally worthless. Fine, I would enthusiastically validate their thesis. I would save their entire legacy through a complex network of anonymous legal trusts. I would do it because a little boy with a toy boat deserved a place to learn about the tides, and I would extract exactly 0 compensation for my labor. Not a single dime of equity, and certainly not a forced apology. That was the uncompromising strategy I finalized in the dark. I almost succeeded in pulling it off. The next morning, I walked into the office of Marcus Vance, an incredibly sharp, heavily caffeinated maritime attorney I trusted with my life. Marcus had clawed his way up from public defense and possessed 0 tolerance for wealthy family melodrama. I sat in his office, drank his terrible coffee, and laid out the entire intricate architecture of the rescue. We would use a shell proxy to represent the Federal Maritime Heritage Foundation. The proxy offers to purchase the development rights to the Blackwood acreage. The massive influx of federal funds instantly liquidates the predatory commercial mortgages and pays the back taxes. The catch is the irreversible easement. The land is legally classified as a working heritage site. No condes puente hagen. No yacht clubs. No luxury development. Ever again. Julian and the family retain operational ownership, but they are stripped of the ability to ever leverage the land for commercial real estate debt again. And crucially, the entire salvation appears to fall from the sky as a miraculous federal grant program targeting struggling historical sites. My name exists absolutely nowhere in the correspondence. Marcus listened to my relentless, rapid-fire presentation, clicking his pen against his desk. When I finished, he stared at me with narrowed eyes. "Are you absolutely certain you possess the psychological fortitude to pull this off without demanding they know you are the architect?" he asked, his voice cutting through the room. I looked him dead in the eye and said yes. I actually believed my own lie as the word left my mouth. There was one massive, unavoidable logistical hurdle that I could not strategize my way around. Julian was the sole legal owner of the property, Absolutely nothing could happen without the property owner's notarized signature on the federal easement contracts. This meant I had to maneuver a massive stack of highly restrictive legal documents into my brother's trembling hands, compel him to read them, and trick him into signing them, all without him ever suspecting that his estranged, disappointing sister was the puppet master pulling the strings from 100 miles away. So, I weaponized the system. Marcus initiated formal contact through the foundation, presenting the offer exactly as it was on paper. A ruthless but legitimate federal conservation bailout. He sent the massive legal binders via registered courier, operating out of a sterile corporate address in Boston that held zero connection to me. Then, the agonizing wait began. I am historically terrible at waiting. I waited 5 days, sweating through my clothes, wondering if a golden boy drowning in debt possessed too much inherited arrogance to accept a lifeline thrown by a faceless federal bureaucracy. He took the lifeline. Of course he took it. He had a bank auction breathing down his neck, a toddler sleeping in the next room, and a terrifying mother who would rather watch the family burn to ash than admit her chosen heir had failed. Julian signed the massive conservation agreement without possessing a fraction of an idea whose brilliant mind had constructed it. My grandmother Eleanor had been dead for 3 years, and her calloused hands were still firmly gripping the steering wheel of our family. The executed documents arrived at Marcus' office. The federal foundation wired the preservation funds. The bank foreclosure was instantly terminated, canceled with the cold, silent efficiency that only occurs when someone who intimately understands the legal machinery pulls the exact correct lever. For the first time in 35 years, I was holding the absolute survival of my entire bloodline in the palm of my hand, and not a single one of them knew I was even in the room. For approximately 3 weeks, the illusion held perfectly, and I must admit, the absolute silence of the aftermath terrified me far more than the crisis itself. The debts evaporated. The property taxes were dissolved into the federal easement exactly the way my grandmother had calculated. The Blackwood Marina was bulletproof, protected from developers forever. I had executed the impossible, and my identity remained a ghost. It was supposed to feel like absolute closure. It did not. I found myself lingering in my dark office long past midnight, staring at the harbor lights, relentlessly interrogating my own motives. Why had I actually engineered this massive rescue? For the preservation of the docks, I whispered to the empty room, for little Leo playing in the gravel. Both were factually true, but there was a third, darker truth coiled at the bottom of my stomach, and I despised the shape of it. Whenever I examined it closely, it turned around and stared back at me, wearing my mother's mocking smile. Here is the humiliating reality I hid from Marcus. A deep, infected fragment of my psyche was still holding its breath. I was not waiting for a polite thank you card. I was waiting for the catastrophic, earth-shattering moment when the veil was ripped away. The moment they finally discovered the identity of their savior, forcing my mother to stand in a room and process the agonizing realization that the daughter she threw away was the God who spared her empire. I had orchestrated an anonymous miracle while telling myself I was a saint. But beneath the altruism, I was still that 32-year-old woman sitting in a rigid chair, violently desperate to be seen as valuable. I recognized the poison, and I established a brutal test for myself. I swore I would keep my identity buried until the day I died. No dramatic revelations, no cinematic confrontations, no demanding tears of regret. If I could not maintain that silence, then I had not saved the boatyard for Leo. I had saved it to feed my own starved ego. My vow of silence survived for exactly 14 days. Julian, to his credit, was not the type of man who accepts a multi-million-dollar federal miracle without aggressively investigating the source. He began relentlessly calling the foundation directors in Boston, expressing his profound gratitude, and asking increasingly specific questions about the anonymous benefactors and historical architects who had expedited his specific case. He wanted a name. He wanted someone to invite to dinner. The foundation deflected his inquiries with professional grace, exactly as I had legally mandated. But Julian was persistent. He called every 3 days, his questions circling closer and closer to the hidden core of the trust. I sat in my Portland office, listening to Marcus recount his investigations, and I felt the walls of my perfectly constructed sanctuary beginning to crack. I had built an impenetrable fortress to save my family, but I had intentionally neglected to build a door for their gratitude, because I knew their gratitude would shatter my resolve. I must pause to explain Julian's psychology. It is incredibly easy to cast him as the spoiled, incompetent villain of this narrative, but that is intellectually lazy. When we were teenagers, during the nights, our mother went on one of her terrifying cold rages, plunging the entire house into absolute silence. Julian would creep into my bedroom. He would sit on the edge of my rug, trembling with anxiety, and I would distract him by sketching absurd, impossible boats until he could breathe normally again. He was not born believing his life was inherently more valuable than mine. He was methodically trained to believe it, brainwashed over decades by the exact same woman who trained me to believe I was worthless. My mother simply placed us on opposite ends of a rigged scale. Julian happened to be assigned the side that received the applause. But relentless, unearned praise is just a heavily gilded cage. I comprehend that now. He had been handed a $5 million commercial enterprise as tangible proof of his superiority, and the terrifying pressure of maintaining that illusion was pushing him toward a breakdown. He never realized the boatyard was never a gift. It was a test he was designed to fail. And then, the architecture of my plan collapsed, exactly where the law required it to. The final, permanent recording of the federal historic easement mandated a physical, original signature from the lead preservation architect of record. This document had to be filed into the county municipal registry, a public database where any citizen with an internet connection could view it. My signature. There was no legal loophole to exploit, no shell corporation to absorb the impact. If I dragged my pen across that dotted line, the name Clara Vance would be permanently fused to the Blackwood Marina rescue in the public archives. The entire invisible fortress I had bled to build would be instantly vulnerable to anyone who bothered to read the final page. I sat at my heavy oak desk for 3 hours, staring at the single sheet of paper. The streetlights outside buzzed in the fog. If I sign the paper, the boatyard is permanently saved. But I am exposed to the family I swore to avoid. If I refuse to sign it, my identity remains a flawless secret. And the bank seizes the docks on Monday morning. There is no version of authentic sacrifice that allows you to keep your hands perfectly clean. I uncapped my pen. I did not experience a swell of noble, cinematic courage. It was a cold, brutale calculation. And it forced me to admit a humiliating truth about myself. When the absolute final choice was placed in front of me to protect my family's legacy or protect my own fragile pride, the legacy won without a fight. My grandmother did not leave me that letter so I could win a psychological war against my mother. She left it so the wooden docks would survive the century. I wrote Clara Vance in heavy black ink. I handed the document to Marcus, and I allowed my name to be locked into the public record. I tried to convince myself that Julian was entirely too lazy to read the final pages of a 100-page federal filing. I was wrong. The catastrophic realization occurred during the final notary closing at the bank. The bank officer, diligently finalizing the massive restructuring. Push the towering stack of finalized easement papers across the table for Julian to initial, hidden deep within the dense, bureaucratic jargon of the appendices, proudly occupying the line designated for lead architect, was my name. Julian told me months later that he stared at the ink for 3 full minutes. He genuinely believed it was a typographical error. He thought there must be a second Clara Vance operating in the New England maritime sector. And then, the crushing gravity of the truth collapsed his lungs. The faceless, bureaucratic savior who had miraculously reached into his nightmare and dragged his family back from the abyss was the sister he had watched walk out of a lawyer's office 3 years ago. The sister who had engineered the entire multi-million-dollar salvation in total silence, demanding absolutely nothing. My cell phone vibrated violently against my kitchen counter that same evening. I watched his name illuminate the screen through 4 agonizing rings. When I finally pressed accept, there was no standard greeting, just the sound of his jagged, panicked breathing. He sounded exactly like the terrified teenager sitting on my rug. "Was this you?" He choked out. "The foundation, the trust, the federal grants, was all of this you?" "Clara." I possessed the skills to lie seamlessly. I had spent months manipulating the legal system, but he was my older brother. And I was suddenly, overwhelmingly exhausted by the heavy armor I was carrying. "Yes," I said softly. "It was me." I leaned against my kitchen counter and listened to the absolute silence on the line. I could physically feel 3 decades of family mythology disintegrating in his mind. The brilliant son and the defective daughter, the worthy heir and the disappointment, the entire toxic foundation of our family was burning to the ground in the space of a single phone call. The legacy was secure, but the camouflage was destroyed. And secrets, in our family, are volatile explosives that never stay contained. Julian cycled through a hurricane of emotions in 3 minutes. He was wildly, incoherently grateful. Then he was violently ashamed of his own gratitude. And finally, he became deeply terrified. Because he understood the exact mechanics of our family dynamics, he asked the single question that defined our existence. "What do you want?" "Clara, what is your price for doing this?" He asked it with such genuine, confused desperation that it broke my heart. He fundamentally did not possess the emotional vocabulary to comprehend an act that did not require a transaction. In my mother's house, every single interaction was recorded in a psychological ledger. Debts were always collected. I want absolutely nothing. "Julian," that was the entire architecture of the plan. He fell silent. He could not process the concept. He had been measured by the exact same brutal scale I had, and he could not fathom a world where the scale did not exist. Then he whispered the reality we both feared. "Mom is going to find out. The bank officers talk. And Clara, when she finds out, she is not going to be grateful. You know exactly what she will do." My mother discovered the truth within 4 days. I never cared to investigate the exact vector of the leak. Perhaps Julian broke down and confessed. Or perhaps the small-town rumors simply gravitated toward her the way iron filings pull toward a magnet. The method was irrelevant. Her reaction was the only thing that mattered. Because it confirmed that her soul had not changed a fraction of a degree, she experienced absolutely zero gratitude. True gratitude would have required her to sit in a quiet room and admit to herself that her empire had been rescued by the very child she had discarded as defective. That level of self-reflection was completely alien to her psychology. Instead, she shifted into a state of aggressive tactical warfare. If the disappointment had somehow orchestrated a $5 million federal rescue, then the narrative had to be immediately rewritten so it was no longer a rescue at all. It had to be rebranded as a brilliant, collaborative family strategy. She reached for her psychological measuring tape one final time, desperate to shrink me back down into a manageable size she could control, and she began demanding meetings. Marcus Vance called me on a Tuesday. The tone in his voice was absolute steel. My parents' legal team had officially requested a final, mandatory summit. They wanted all parties at the same table to execute the final transfer of the operational trust. The moment Marcus informed me, the invisible barrier I had built between Portland and my hometown evaporated. I had crossed a threshold, and there was no retreating into the shadows. My name was permanently carved into the property deeds, and my mother was demanding my presence. The era of hiding was over. They required me to sit at a mahogany table again, but this time, for the first time in the history of my bloodline, I was the one holding all the leverage. It was a different law firm, but the conference room was entirely identical. It possessed the exact same suffocating smell of leather binding and bitter, burnt coffee. My mother sat at the center of the table, wearing a flawless silk blouse, her posture as rigid as a steel beam. My father sat beside her, looking fragile and translucent. The winter stroke, having stolen the robust authority he used to project, Julian was present. But this time, he deliberately positioned his chair halfway down the table, creating a visible physical distance between himself and our parents. I walked into the room entirely alone. I was 35 years old, wearing a simple entree, tailored coat, and my hands were completely empty. For the first time in my existence, I did not need to carry armor into their presence. I took my seat in a heavy leather chair, entirely relaxed. No one offered a condescending indecision, charitable smile. This time, the room was vibrating with nervous energy because they had absolutely no idea what kind of weapon I was carrying. Marcus opened the meeting. He laid out the reality of the situation with the brutal, emotionless efficiency of an assassin. He detailed how the Blackwood Marina was now permanently protected under a federal maritime easement. The commercial debt was eradicated, and the property was entirely immune to future bank foreclosures. Then, Marcus locked eyes with my mother and clearly stated that the sole architect of the months-long, incredibly complex legal maneuver was the daughter sitting at the opposite end of the table. He spoke my name into the sterile air like a judge delivering a final verdict. Claire avance. I sat in my chair and watched the reality detonate across their faces. Julian simply stared at his hands, radiating shame. My mother's jaw clenched so violently, I thought her teeth might crack. A tiny muscle spasming near her temple. And my father, diminished and exhausted, finally processed the magnitude of what had occurred. He stared at me, his eyes wide and watering, and he whispered it to the table, like a man waking from a coma. "That is impossible." Marcus ignored him and continued outlining the federal statutes. My father repeated the phrase, slightly louder, his voice cracking, not because he was arguing the legality, but because his brain could not reconcile the data. "That is impossible." The daughter they had clinically amputated from the family tree, the daughter my mother had publicly humiliated and discarded, was the solitary reason their entire $5 million universe had not been sold to a luxury condo developer at a public auction. My father looked directly into my eyes for the first time in perhaps 20 years. His own eyes brimming with tears he refused to shed. And he whispered it one final time, his defenses completely shattered. "It is impossible." It was the closest he had ever come to apologizing to me. My mother recovered her equilibrium faster than any human being I have ever witnessed. It was her darkest, most terrifying talent. She carefully folded her manicured hands over the polished wood, the icy, benevolent smile creeping back onto her face, and she executed the pivot she had spent her life perfecting. She addressed the room, stating that given the miraculous circumstances, and considering how beautifully the family had collaborated through this difficult transition, it was finally time to correct the minor misunderstandings of the past. It was time, she announced grandly, to formally restore Clara to the family trust, to place my name alongside Julian's on the operational masthead of Blackwood Marina, to bring me back into the fold as a fully vested, highly valued partner. She leaned across the table, her eyes shining with manufactured warmth, offering me the exact prize I had spent 3 decades bleeding to achieve. It was all right there, packaged perfectly in the center of the mahogany table. The exact validation the terrified, rejected, 32-year-old woman in the parking garage had craved like oxygen. To be reinstated, to be publicly acknowledged as brilliant, to be handed a crown by the Queen herself. All I had to do was extend my hand, sign the partnership agreement, and accept my reward. And in that fraction of a second, the entire architecture of my psychological prison became crystal clear. If I reached across that table and accepted the partnership, accepted my name on their letterhead, accepted the sudden shower of praise they were so eager to deploy, I would be willingly placing the psychological measuring tape right back into my mother's hands. She would evaluate me highly this time. Certainly, she would publicly parade me as her brilliant, saving grace. But it would still be her hands operating the scale. My inherent worth would still be entirely dependent on her permission, subject to be revoked the moment I displeased her again. Her praise was forged from the exact same iron as her cruelty. It was just a different type of chain. I had simply never been offered the gilded chain before, so I had failed to recognize it as a restraint. I sat in that heavy leather chair, the silence in the room stretching until it felt brittle. And I realized I had never actually desired their money, their boatyard, or their public approval. I had spent my entire life desperately wanting to stop needing them, and the only remaining method to shatter that need was to look at the ultimate prize they were offering and completely reject it. So, I spoke. No, I said it quietly. Without a trace of anger, I looked directly at my mother and told her I absolutely refused to be restored to the trust. I did not want my name on the operational deed. I completely rejected the seat at the table they were only offering because my brain had suddenly become too profitable to ignore. Before anyone could speak, I slid Marcus' final, prepared document into the center of the table. I produced my pen and signed my name in thick blue ink. The document transferred the entirety of my operational leverage and protective rights into an untouchable blind trust entirely dedicated to Leo, my 4-year-old nephew. It ensured the historic boatyard would remain intact for his generation, permanently blocking Julian or my parents from ever monetizing the land again, and completely scrubbing my identity from any future operational control. I forfeited the money. I forfeited the glorious family restoration. I forfeited the absolute validation I had chased like a phantom my entire life. At the exact second they finally realized my true value, I picked up my coat from the back of the chair. "You can keep the partnership," I told my mother, my voice steady. I never actually needed it. I simply needed to prove to myself that I could walk into this room, look at what you are offering, and walk away. My mother's flawless composure finally violently shattered, and it fractured exactly how I always knew it would. Not into guilt or remorse. She was incapable of those, but into absolute, bewildered rage. She accused me of being theatrical. She called it a manipulative, vindictive performance. She could not comprehend, on a cellular level, why any human being would reject a seat in her kingdom, in her universe, power only flowed in one direction. From the judge down to the desperate subject. She was frantically gripping her psychological scale, but there was absolutely nothing of mine left on the table for her to weigh. Further down the table, Julian was quietly weeping, his head in his hands. When he finally looked up at me, the devastation in his eyes proved that he understood. He was perhaps the first person in our bloodline to completely understand the horrific nature of the game we had been forced to play, and I knew the realization would haunt him forever. I turned and walked toward the exit. I had walked through a heavy wooden door exactly like this one 3 years ago because there was nothing for me to inherit. This time, I walked through the door because I had secured everything that actually mattered, and there was absolutely nothing left in their world that I desired. As I passed my father, his trembling, spotted hand reached out and weakly caught the fabric of my coat sleeve. His mouth opened and closed, struggling violently to form words that had atrophied from 40 years of cowardice. The heavy silence he had worn like armor his entire life was too massive to dismantle in a single afternoon. He could not speak, but he held my sleeve for 3 agonizing seconds, and I allowed him that grace. Before gently pulling the fabric from his fingers, I walked out of the sterile building, stepping into the chaotic, salty air of a typical coastal afternoon that remained entirely indifferent to the fact that I had just rewritten my own history. The boatyard survived. Blackwood Marina is still operating today. The dock's busy with local fishermen, completely immunized against my mother's vanity and Julian's incompetence. My mother still dictates a heavily fabricated narrative to her country club friends, spinning a tale of how the family brilliantly navigated the complex federal bureaucracy to save their heritage. I let her tell the lie. I no longer require the public record to reflect my truth in order to sleep peacefully. My father mailed me a sealed envelope the following spring. I placed it directly inside the heavy cedar box, next to my grandmother's faded blueprints. I have never broken the seal. I may never open it. The profound, beautiful reality is that I am completely at peace either way. I do not need the apology written on that paper to survive. That is the fundamental difference between the shattered woman trembling in the parking garage and the architect I am today. Julian and I speak occasionally. It is a fragile, heavily guarded relationship. We have to meticulously navigate around 30 years of our mother's toxic architecture. But the connection is authentic, which is infinitely more than we ever experienced while living under her roof. He is raising little Leo near the water, and he recently told me that he sat the boy down on the docks and told him a story. He told his son that there was an aunt in Portland who built a massive fortress to protect their home, and walked away without demanding a single piece of gold from the treasury. Leo is going to grow up on historic wooden docks that can never be sold by a predatory bank. He is being raised by a father who is violently fighting his own conditioning, teaching his son that a person's inherent value is not determined by the applause they receive from an audience. The generational curse died in that mahogany conference room. As for me, I drove my truck back up the coast to Portland. Returning to my chaotic office and my endless blueprints, I continued saving historic properties for desperate families, and somewhere during the changing of the seasons, I completely stopped checking over my shoulder to see if my parents were watching my success. That first autumn, I pulled my grandmother's letter out of the cedar box one final time. I sat in my quiet apartment and read her trembling handwriting aloud to the empty room. You will know exactly how to deploy this, my brilliant girl, because you are the only one in this house who ever truly loved the salt, not the status. I carefully folded the parchment along its worn creases, placed it gently back into the dark wood interior, and secured the heavy latch. And for the first time in my existence, closing the lid on a piece of my family did not feel like abandonment. It felt exactly like freedom.